Daniel Zeichner to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered the Task and Finish Group report on taxi and private hire licensing. Thank you, Sir David. It's a pleasure to serve under your...
The question is that this House considers the Task and Finish Group report on taxi and private hire licensing. Daniel Zeichner.
Thank you, Sir David. And it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and it's a pleasure to see familiar faces who have discussed these issues over quite a long period of time. And I'd particularly pay tribute to one of the former Transport Ministers, who I think I saw a few moments ago, the Right Honourable Member for South Holland and the Deepings, who instigated this review in this very chamber some 18 months ago. And obviously the main praise, and I will be praising quite a few people in my opening remarks, Sir David, must go to Professor Mohammed Abdul Hook, who has brought together a diverse range of voices from across both the industry and users, and produced, in the words of the Right Honourable Member for Birkenhead, a quite superb report. Not everyone will agree with all of it, and that's part of the reason we're here today, just to debate some of the issues. But I think what we can probably all agree on is our thanks to the Professor for bringing this report forward. And I would start by setting the scene, in fact, just by quoting from a couple of points in it, which I think do set the scene rather well. Right in the introduction, the Professor says, "I trust that Parliament and Department will lead the cultural change which is necessary to ensure that passengers, workers, operators and neighbouring authorities are treated fairly. I look forward to the Government's prompt response to this report in order to maintain the momentum for improvement. Undue delay would risk public safety." And it is one message that I hope will come out of this debate today. It is that undue delay would risk public safety. We only have an hour and a half this afternoon, Sir David, so I'm not going to go through the report line by line. I think that needs to be done another day when legislation comes forward. But there's a little to be said, perhaps, on how we got here originally, or perhaps possibly how we didn't get here. And I'm afraid the government does have to take some responsibility, it seems to me. And on page 16 of the report, the Professor refers in paragraph 3.7 to the Law Commission review back in 2011. He says it's deeply regrettable that the government has not yet responded to the report and the draft bill which the Commission subsequently published in 2014. Had the government acted sooner, the concerns that led to the formation of this group may have been avoided. And that seems to me to be quite a strong charge and quite a strong point. But in other ways, we are where we are. Looking back tells us something, but what we've got to concentrate on is looking forward. And I very much hope we will get a strong response from the Minister today. I should say, first of all, I congratulate him on his recent promotion, possibly not in circumstances he would have sought, but I would also commend his predecessor for a very principled decision, in my view. To return to the report, Mr. Crosby, as I've said, many thanks already to some, but and there are some in this room today in the audience who have also contributed very strongly to this report. The work of London Taxi Drivers Association, GMB, Unite, the Susie Lamplugh Trust, Guide Dogs to Transport for London, Helen Chapman and Val Shawcross, who have both spoken to me personally on this, the Local Government Association. And also I have to say the cross-party approach that has been taken to these issues. I've had very good help and support from the current Minister, the Honourable Member for Wealden, in my bill, my private member's bill, which I've been trying to promote. So what I'll try and do, Sir David, is say a little bit about some of the key issues. I'll say a little bit about where my bill got to and how it has been referenced in the report and how I hope it will go forward, and then pick up on one or two of the more controversial issues in the report, which I think probably bear discussion. But just at the outset, I'd say a little bit about just how extraordinary this industry is and how it has changed so dramatically. Interestingly, probably since the Law Commission report. To be honest, if the government ever did finally respond to it, I suspect it'd be way out of date by now. We've seen huge change in the last few years with changing technologies. And of course, we have huge numbers of private hire vehicles and taxis on our streets. So now 285,400 licensed taxis and private hire vehicles with 361,500 driver licenses. I don't think people realise quite the scale of this industry, with 137,000 of those in London. And there's been a 120% increase in the number of private hire vehicles in London between 2005 and 2018. But across those numbers, there are many different stories, and it's one of the points that I've consistently tried to make, that it's not always the same. We had the excellent all-party group report, which was led by my honourable friend, member last year, which stimulated the debate which I referred to earlier. An excellent report, but I think I said at the time, somewhat London-focused. Not to say that London isn't important, it's hugely important, but anything we bring forward has got to work not just for London, which of course operates under different legislation at the moment anyway, but the rest of the country too, and that's part of the challenge. Now, we're very happy to give way.
Will he agree with me that the reports that have been published both by the APPG and by the Task and Finish Group indicate that we do need new primary legislation to adapt to the sort of changes in the taxi and private hire sector he's outlined, and that should include national minimum standards to ensure that we protect passenger safety and security?
Daniel Zeichner.
I will be coming on to that point, but of course it is one of the headlines that comes from this report that we do need consistent national standards. The question then, of course, is the extent to which they can be tailored and lifted to suit appropriate local circumstances. I wanted to say a little before coming on to that about some of the accessibility issues. Because in London we've got a fantastic record now in terms of our taxis, where they're all 21,000 taxis are wheelchair accessible. But it's not the same story right across the country. Outside London, in metropolitan areas, apparently I'm told it's 83%, but in some rural areas that falls to as low as 15%. And I would say that one of the challenges we face is to make our taxi and private hire fleet more accessible to people right across the country. There's a big variation in terms of disability awareness training for taxi drivers, for instance. Apparently only 41% of local authorities require that training for taxi drivers, dropping to 38% for private hire vehicle drivers. And the percentage of local authorities that require taxi and private hire vehicle drivers to complete child sexual abuse or child sexual exploitation training has risen over the past few years, partly in response to some of the very sad incidents we've seen in some parts of the country. It's risen to 70%, but that means that nearly 100 licensing authorities still do not require drivers to undertake this training. And Sir David, I first became interested in this subject when I had the privilege to serve for a couple of years as a Shadow Transport Minister. And then after that period had the opportunity to bring forward a private member's bill. And I chose for that bill to try and do something about some of these safety issues, which, as I say, there is cross-party consensus on. So I brought forward my licensing of taxis and private hire vehicles bill some 18 months ago, and in the course of that bill had the opportunity to discuss with enforcement officers and officials right across the country, from Knowsley to London, to talk to taxiing firms, private hire firms, from Brighton to Manchester.
Will my honourable friend give way?
Absolutely.
I'm very grateful, and I would like to congratulate my honourable friend for securing this really important debate. It's very timely, and if I could just refer to our recent visit to Bristol, as members of the Transport Select Committee, and we saw the problems of traffic congestion and the number of private hire vehicles from outside of the city that were causing additional problems of air pollution and congestion. And isn't there an overwhelming case to cut the number of private hire vehicles outside of London? You did quote a huge figure just in your opening remarks.
Daniel Zeichner.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and he and I had a fascinating trip with the Transport Select Committee to Bristol yesterday. And I think what I would observe from that is the same kind of issues crop up all around the country in different forms. I had spent some years before coming into this House and as a constituency member trying to understand the complexities of the taxi and private hire industry in my own constituency in and around Cambridge. And exactly the same issues arise, where quite often you get licensing standards in a city, which are set at one level, and then many, many private hire vehicles coming in from the immediately adjacent area. And I think we heard this in Bristol yesterday, where the vast majority of private hire vehicles are actually registered in South Gloucester, creating a conundrum for people in the City of Bristol and the local council there. And this goes to the heart of one of these questions about, refers back to the point raised by the Right Honourable Lady earlier, about national standards. And of course you can.
Very grateful to my honourable friend, and can I congratulate him for securing this important debate. The point he's making is very pertinent in South Yorkshire, where obviously we had the terrible scandal of CSE in Rotherham, and as a consequence, both Rotherham and Sheffield have very high licensing standards on our taxis, with CCTV required in Rotherham, but of course operators and licensed drivers from other areas can come in and completely undercut those measures and undercut all those efforts to tackle the prevalence of grooming gangs and the ability of them to exploit young children in South Yorkshire. So can I add my voice to the calls from across parties for national minimum standards, which are absolutely vital to prevent this exact exploitation.
Hear, hear. Daniel Zeichner.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and this was one of the issues I suppose I spent much of my time discussing with people, trying to get that balance between the very high standards that we should rightly expect where there are specific problems, without damaging an industry in other areas and putting undue costs and burdens, which would actually leave people with, possibly in some places, with no taxi or private hire vehicle service at all. So a challenge, yes.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I congratulate him on securing this report. Equally, I've got to thank my honourable friend from Ilford North, because he's done a lot of work on this, and I've had discussions with him. And at the same time, I think we should pay tribute to the ex-minister from South Holland in Deeping, because he and I have had a number of meetings. In actual fact, in all fairness, when it's cross-party, he was the man that initiated the report in the first place, so he should get a lot of credit for that. But having said all that, we have a similar problem in Coventry, and there's been a number of incidents between the private hire taxis and drivers from Uber. Let's be frank about that. And to my way of thinking, the report should be implemented in full, because originally it was the coalition that weakened the legislation in the first place. People tend to forget that, but it's cross-party, so I'm not going to go too far down that road. But very often, some of these drivers are actually working a 12 to 13 hour a day, really just on a minimum. In fact, there was a documentary done in the West Midlands a couple of weeks ago that somebody went out with a driver, spent the day with the driver, and he was just making ends meet. So it's not fair on the drivers themselves. They should be given the proper employment rights like everybody else and stop this 0 hour contracts business. And I hope the Minister will address that and put that right, whether it takes primary legislation or not. Because at the end of the day, the Black Cab, in actual fact, is made in Coventry. 2 years ago, everybody was paid off. A new investor came in. Now it's a thriving business. But this particular situation we've got actually threatens that. So there's lots of jobs at stake here as well.
For my honourable friend, and again, I think it is so valuable to hear the different stories from around the country. I remember visiting Coventry some years ago, talking to some of the taxi drivers represented by Unite, and exactly the kind of issues that you have raised. But although they are similar, the issues and the problems, they're not the same everywhere and won't require exactly the same solutions. And I think this is the conundrum that we face. But I'd also pay tribute to the report, because the issues that my honourable friend has just raised, the complex mix of issues, particularly around the rewards and employment protection for drivers, which I will come on to, are part of this package as well. So the report, I will give way.
The honourable gentleman is being very kind in giving way. There is a lot in this report about the influence of new technology on how the taxi fleet should operate. He may be coming on to this, of course, but I wonder if he would like to just say what impact he thinks that new technology will have on the taxi industry.
Daniel Zeichner.
I'm grateful for the honourable member for raising that. I fear that if I were to divert into a lengthy disposition on the impact of new technology, it could be very lengthy indeed, other than to say that it clearly has had a huge impact in recent years. And as so often with new technology, of course, the impact is mixed. There's no doubt that the new app-based technologies have created great opportunities for some, but have led to difficult working conditions for others. some questions around some of the operators in terms of where they pay their taxes and so on. No pun intended. A whole range of issues have come up, and I think the challenge for legislators and for this place is to make some attempt to keep up, and this will be, I'm afraid, one of my criticisms of the government. As the years have passed, the legislative void has opened up more and more problems, and particularly left local authorities and enforcement officers with considerable problems, because we have seen people out there in the real world respond quite quickly to technological change, whereas we seem to struggle, quite frankly, to set the right frameworks. But pulling it back to the report, as I will try to do, I think one of the strengths of it is that in a relatively short report, 35 pages, it has managed in language that most of us can understand, and probably the wider world can understand too, to summarise a whole range of these issues in a readily understandable way, Sir David, and including sections on working practices, on changes in technology. I suspect if a committee were to take it forward or it needed legislation, it would probably end up being a much, much longer document, as of course the Law Commission document was some years ago. But I think it's really welcome that we've got a comprehensible and comprehensive account which does deal with a number of these things. And one of the key recommendations is the national minimum standards. But, and I think this is the key point, this is in recommendation 2, is that you can build upon them. Now, my bill, Sir David, looked at the other side of the coin, which is enforcement. For anyone who's been out with either taxi or private hire drivers or with enforcement teams, they will probably pretty quickly come to realise it's a very complicated area indeed, made much more complicated when you have the examples that we made reference to, where you have drivers who are licensed somewhere else being enforced upon by enforcement officers who essentially can only apply their own area's rules. And quite frankly, it is pretty clear that it's not working, put simply. So my bill would have made it possible for local enforcement officers, local to a particular area, to enforce against drivers visiting or applying their trade in that area. And I'm very pleased to say that within this report, in recommendation 9, a very similar recommendation is made. My bill also suggested a national database, because the current situation, sadly, is, and we've seen some notorious incidents, where someone can effectively lose their licence in one area, go to another authority and make an application. Yep. And because that local authority has no way of knowing the previous record, can issue another licence, and then because of this situation where people are working out of area, can actually be back on those same streets where the local authority has tried to protect the public against those drivers, sometimes within a matter of weeks. And so the intention was to create a national database where local authorities would record the refusals, revocations and suspensions, and when any authority was issuing a new licence, it would check that database. And it might sound like quite a complicated process, but actually, particularly through the work of the Local Government Association, that's actually been established, not at huge cost, fairly minor cost, and it's actually being run by the National Anti-Fraud Network. But the problem at the moment, Sir David, is it's voluntary. And that will probably mean, as so often with our legislation, that all the people who are complying and doing the right things will be taking part in this, and the ones that we're seeking to catch out, if you like, or to check up on, may not be. And again, one of the recommendations from the report is that this should become mandatory. So I was extremely grateful to the government and the Minister for supporting my bill, and I think it was worked up very effectively. Sadly, as sometimes happens with private members' bill, it fell foul of one or two individuals, which I think is a great shame, because it may well be that, sadly, that we will see incidents over the next few months or years which could have been prevented had this legislation gone through with all party support. But we are where we are, and the important thing is it's in this report, and the question will be whether the Minister can find a way of taking it forward. So of the 34 recommendations, many of which I think we would all agree with, I would just like to comment on one or two. We've already talked about the national minimum standards, and I think it's very clear that this report clearly retains the two-tier approach to private hire vehicle and taxi licensing, which sometimes has been questioned. The cross-border issue, which has already been referred to, has been one of the, of course, most controversial issues in recent times, affected very directly by the new technologies, which make the place-based legislation that we've inherited and have been using for a long time seem woefully out of date. Now, I think, again, one of the strengths of this report is that the chairman was good enough to actually allow members of the committee to put their comments in the appendices at the end, so we can actually see the differing views. And there are differing views on this. But the report comes down on the side of a recommendation which came also from the all-party group last year, that we need to implement a basis upon which journeys should start or end within the area in which the vehicle operator and driver are licensed. Now, there are some downsides to that. We know that in some places that could make life a little bit more difficult and more complicated, but I would say that on balance, this seems to be the right way to go. And I'm sure others may wish to comment on that. Now, I've had some come to me say that this would have great difficulties, may sometimes create unnecessary driving back to and from destinations, some potential environmental damage, could create problems for chauffeur services, particularly to airports, and obviously that's a very extensive trade, although I have to say I think most of us hope it may be a trade that might be diminished in the future in terms of trying to improve our air quality and surface access to airports. But it does not seem to me it's beyond the bounds of possibility to actually find a way through that. And I think if you read closely some of the comments in the appendices, I detect perhaps a growing consensus that this could be achieved without necessarily causing the complete set of problems that are claimed. The other controversial proposal, recommendation 8, is a cap on private hire vehicle numbers. For those who have been following these debates for many years, of course, we went through an extensive period when there was a discussion about whether there should be a cap on hackney carriages. And my city is one of those that's been through both. And I have to say that when we introduced the cap, I think it's widely been considered to be for the best for everybody. And clearly the Mayor of London and the evidence that is in the report from Helen Chapman on behalf of Transport for London, I think puts it very well. That what we are seeing, and my honourable friend who's now not in his place made reference to this following our visit to Bristol yesterday, we are seeing levels of congestion in some of our cities at the moment, which are partly attributable to the significant rise in private hire vehicles. Other issues as well, but if you're trying to tackle the air quality issues, Sir David, I would suggest that local authorities need the opportunity to consider it. It's not a blanket suggestion that numbers are going to be capped everywhere. There would have to be a public interest test. It would have to be part of a wider strategy. But it does seem to me that that too is the way forward. My final comments in general would just touch on the workers' rights issues. The report, I think, rightly says there are bigger, wider issues that go beyond the taxi and private hire industry, and there are obviously proposals coming from the Taylor Review, and these are controversial and contested areas. I certainly wouldn't suggest that they are simple, but I fear we are seeing growing evidence that some of the rates for drivers, even using the new technologies, are being forced downwards, and we're seeing potentially vulnerable workers in a pretty it's not exactly an equal balance of power from where they're seeing it. So it does seem to me that action should be taken. I would strongly want to see stronger support for drivers. But recommendation 34, and the suggestion here, and driven very much in this report in terms of passenger safety, which of course is very, very important, but it has been pointed out to me that by people who work in the industry, by Unite, by Steve McNamara and others from the LTDA, that some of this has been tried before. Trying to have a tachograph in a cab is different from having it in a lorry or a bus. Is much more waiting time, and I think we're going to have to find other ways of dealing with that issue rather than the one that's actually suggested in the report. I actually say I rather agree with Steve McNamara that if drivers were better recompensed and they weren't being driven, wages weren't being driven down so low, there would be less incentive to work over long hours. But I think one of the other things we need to know is exactly what the evidence is And I think that possibly requires more work in terms of where long hours are leading to safety issues. Because in the end, the overriding issue for me has got to be safety. So let me return to where I began, Sir David. I think the introduction, which I quoted at the beginning, the Chair very clearly says there must not be further delay and prevarication. Undue delay would risk public safety. And that's a very, very strong message, because we have had too many years of delay. This is a hugely important industry, hugely important for many of our people, especially in areas where public transport can no longer provide the kind of 24-hour service that people need to get to work and to go about their business. It's a fantastic industry. It's got a proud tradition. It's got a very, very important future. The problem is there are a few people sometimes who are abusing the system, abusing the licensing system, and creating some of the awful incidents that we've seen in some parts of the country. So I think we owe it to the industry, to the people who are working hard within it. We owe it to passengers to make sure they're safe. And what we've got here with this report, I would say, is an opportunity to move swiftly to implement a whole range of things which are not contentious, to take some decisions, which is what governments ought to do, on some of the things that possibly are more contentious. But I would suggest, Sir David, that if this report was implemented pretty well in full, there would be widespread support for a government that did that, and it would make our country safer and the industry much more secure and have a vibrant future.
Hear, hear. The question is that this House has considered the Task and Finish Group report on taxi and private hire licensing. Now, I want to call the three front benches at 3:30, and if they could keep their remarks below 10 minutes, then we'll have the opportunity to call Mr Zeichner to wind up. There are four back benches standing, so if they could keep their contributions around the 8-minute mark, then everyone will be called. Mr Ian Duncan Smith.
Sir David, thank you very much indeed. I congratulate the honourable gentleman for gaining this debate, and I also echo his comments in congratulating Mohammed Abdul Haq in what is essentially a very comprehensive and good report. You don't have to agree with everything in it, but essentially the direction of travel, I hope that the government will realise now there's a lot of agreement across all parties to drive a lot of this forward, to make the changes that are necessary to improve taxis across the UK. But I want to keep my remarks really focused fairly narrowly on London, and particularly on the effect on black cabs of the enormous increase in the number of hire vehicles, mostly down to Uber. I want to just quote, well, I first of all want to say to some of the people that have actually been lobbying me here to come here, quite rightly too, have found their incomes that have fallen quite considerably. And I think I want to focus, and I hope the Minister will take this clearly, on some of the issues that arise from this. First of all, I want to make the point that there are four areas here. Uber, I think, is massively now adding to London congestion. I think the figures now show that. The honourable gentleman who's just spoken made the point about increased numbers of vehicles on the road. I think a huge, significant amount of that is down to the arrival of Uber. I also don't, and I think it is time to look at the business model again with Uber, and not really, I don't think we would all agree, I hope, paying its fair share towards the upkeep of the very roads that they run on through the normal tax base. That would be the key here. I think also, echoing something of the honourable gentleman's comments, that their business model, I don't think really, whichever way you like the flexibility, and I am somebody that does think that flexibility is important in these things, and the gig economy opens up huge amounts of competition, but I do think there's a moment when you do need to recognise that the drivers of Uber do tend, as far as I see, to be treated pretty unfairly in general terms. I think that they're scraping by in many cases, and often not really well supported by the organisation that says they don't employ them, which I always find rather bizarre, but they do. And that's really the point that I wanted to make. This idea that somehow they're going to be incredibly successful directly as a result of this has proved mostly to be quite incorrect. And I'm particularly concerned as well when I look at what Uber are doing. There's a lot of talk about how of course, they've got the prices down and everything else, but the truth is that they I think their model is all about arriving in an area and eventually undercutting everything else that's there, eventually then driving people out of business and building up a model that allows them to raise their prices. And I'm interested that they even use this algorithm that allows them to focus at times when there is a demand to actually jack their prices up, whereas the black cabs that they compete with are not, of course, allowed to do that. They have a fixed price set for them, regardless of whether you can't find a taxi and it's pouring with rain, they still charge the same figure. And I think this is an area, really, which causes a great concern, and many of those in my constituency and others who themselves ply their trade in black cabs will comment that this has led to all sorts of problems. And often they get real complaints when they go into their, they get passengers into their taxis, that they've actually been paying much more recently taking a car, an Uber car, and they wonder why that is. And I think it's quite important, therefore, that when we look at this, and I do recognise the report has covered much of this, but the one area I thought that the Honourable Gentleman made, which is something which we need to focus on much more, this is not just a free-for-all. After all, the scale of the increase of traffic on the roads now in London, notwithstanding the fact that the previous mayor has significantly managed to cut out quite a lot of the various traffic lanes in London due to cycling. I'm sure we all want to see more cyclists on the road. But the reality is, as a result of that, you've got more cars on slightly lesser lanes in London, and the figures are quite staggering. I was reading this the other day, and it's that the same period, the number of private hire vehicles has increased by more than 50%, and the TfL data shows that between 2011 and 2017, there was a 39% increase in private hire licenses, taking the total to over 87,000 vehicles, which is up by 40,000. And that's only in the space of a few years. So the Honourable Gentleman was absolutely correct. In fact, I would have liked to have stayed longer on this one, because I think this is such an important point. The side effect of this is now quite significant. And for those of us who are London MPs, we see it every single day. And we can see, the complaints that go on about, productivity in London being affected dramatically by the inability of vehicles to get around, to do their deliveries, etc., because the scale of traffic inside this city now is astonishingly large. And I think it's a matter the government does need to look at carefully in the nature of the way that they actually think that while the gratification for some becomes a serious problem for others. And I also want to touch on the point, and I am conscious, David, of time. I'm going to get this as quickly as I can. The particular business model which I mentioned earlier about Uber's business model, I am concerned, and anybody should be concerned, that all right, for a short period of time when things are really going and getting going and you want companies to get those opportunities and you don't want them to be trammelled with too much tax, I'm absolutely a believer of that. But I do think when an organisation is clearly as large as this and quite so dominant, I think there is really a genuine reason why we need to look again at that business model. And the figures I think which are most startling is that Uber paid £411,000 in corporation tax in 2016 on a turnover of 23.3 million, and that masks a number of payments as well, and they've set themselves up in Holland. I understand that competition. My concern here is that who is going to pay, ultimately, for the roads and the conditions that we're in if they are not to contribute? Now, black cabs are contributing through their tax and national insurance, and the other private hire vehicles, many of whom have been used regularly and absolutely above board, they all have to pay through tax and the way their company tax and regulations are set. But this organisation gets away with making next to no contribution to the road state and to the nature of what they use as they ply their businesses, although they keep on saying that they're not the ones that ply their trade, it's the drivers who are independent. But the result of they wouldn't be able to ply their trade if there wasn't Uber there, and it would be a very different game. And I also say that and I'm going to conclude on this, Sir David, my real concern is that, and I want to mention a few names of some of my constituents who've seen me over this: Ron Nicholson, Martin Franks, Mark Digan, Stephen Tyson, Trevor Board, and others who I've met, and they're all straightforward people who are trying to earn a living. And we have in London, in the black cab system, arguably the most admired system in the world.
Yeah.
You know, it's on all the posters. You know, I noticed that the ministers for trade go out selling the idea of coming here to get black cabs, and yet, and when we regulate this incredibly highly, and it has to have disabled access, and obviously proud of the fact that that is the case, and unlike going to a place like New York or whatever, where you tend to find there's a bit more of a free-for-all, here we do generally have a seriously good service with people that are really straightforward and want to do a good job. And we regulate them. And yet they're in competition with them now with using this app is an organization that has to do none of these things. And at the same time has now broken this point about hailing from the road. The truth is the app now makes it almost old, ancient history. The reality is they are, in essence, getting passengers from the road because of the use of the app. So we need to rethink this. We cannot have it both ways. I think we have to decide either we admire, want to continue with a service of regulated vehicles and drivers that produces an excellent service, particularly in central London, or we don't. But you can't have this unfair level of competition, this unlevel playing field which is taking place, and the result, as I say, of higher congestion. So I'd urge my right honourable friend to take into consideration what is the consensus, particularly of those of us who are London MPs, but wider too, many who come down from other constituencies and use what is an excellent service here. I would urge him to take consideration that now is the time not just to take this report into consideration and to do something about it, but to genuinely ask that question, do we really value what we've got? Because if we don't, we will lose it, and if we lose it, we will end up in an absolute free-for-all.
Serve under your chairmanship, and I want to begin by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Cambridge, not only for securing this debate this afternoon, but also for his consistent work as the Member of Parliament for Cambridge over the last 3 years in keeping these issues on the agenda, not least through the private members' bill and the issues that he sought to raise. I hope that the result of the debate we're having this afternoon and the excellent report that we're here to consider, that many of those really commendable points he was raising in his bill will finally find their way onto the statute books. I rise today as chair of the all-party parliamentary group on taxes. This is a particularly important issue for my constituency, where well over 1,000 of my constituents are either licensed London taxi drivers or private hire drivers, and what the all-party parliamentary group has sought to do during its short lifespan is to make the case for urgent and far-reaching reforms of the taxi and private hire licensing architecture. And as we've seen this afternoon, we have a growing membership, but also a really strong cross-party membership. And I think there are 3 points I want to make to the Minister this afternoon overall. And I congratulate him on his promotion in the reshuffle. And I also particularly want to commend our Minister, the member for Wealdon, for her diligent attention to these issues and for her engagement with the all-party parliamentary group. The 3 points I want to make overall is, firstly, there is strong cross-party consensus on the need for change, and urgently. That's an important point to make, particularly given the current arithmetic of Parliament, but I hope that ministers will be reassured that if, as I hope they will, they bring forward legislation at the first opportunity, they will find strong cross-party support for the proposals we're discussing today. The second point I want to make is that passenger safety and accessibility must be at the heart of the system. And I think we've now seen across 2 reports, the report published by the all-party parliamentary group on taxes and the excellent report we're discussing today, that clearly the current system has fallen well short of our expectations and of the bar that we should rightly set to keep our constituents safe. And the third is that we urgently need to address the working conditions of so many people working, particularly in the private hire industry. And it should not be left to unions like the GMB to drag big multinational corporations through the courts in order to assure basic rights, workplace rights and protections that have been fought for and won by working people over the best part of a century. So in turning to the report, let me begin, first of all, by thanking Professor Mohammed Abdul Huck for an absolutely outstanding report. And as has already been said, I also want to particularly pay tribute to the Right Honourable Member for South Holland and the Deepings. He was an excellent minister. This report wouldn't be here were it not for his efforts. We welcomed his engagement with the All-Party Parliamentary Group as a minister, and we're delighted that he's able to join us this afternoon to add his considerable voice and weight to the debate. To his enormous credit, Mohammed Abdul Haq has engaged widely in the production of this report, and I think the quality and quantity of the engagement is reflected in the strength of the report itself. There are obviously going to be differences and competing interests, but what I think he has succeeded in doing is listening to everyone, engaging properly and coming up with a comprehensive and coherent set of reforms that will address what I think are widespread concerns of many different parts of the taxi and private hire industry. I'll certainly give way.
I would like to identify with his remarks about the professor who done quite a considerable amount of work on this and produced a good report. In fact, I actually met him with a trade union official, so I would remiss earlier for not identifying the professor as doing a hell of a lot of good work on this.
I strongly agree with my honourable friend, and also thank him for his engagement consistently in the All-Party Parliamentary Group and on the floor of the House in raising these issues and bringing them to the attention of ministers. The report that we're discussing today is a whole package of reforms, and I would strongly emphasise to ministers and the department that they ought to be implemented in full. We've already heard in previous speeches and interventions that I think there is clear consensus on the need for clear national minimum standards that apply right across the country. Of course, there will be, for very good reasons, not least alluded to by my honourable friend, the member for Sheffield Heeley, around child sexual exploitation and particular local issues. There will always be areas where local authorities will want to enhance those standards and protections and develop appropriate local tools and solutions to properly regulating the taxi and private hire industry in their area. But our starting point has to be clear minimum standards. I think that point is actually accepted by the department. So taking that into account, let me just turn to a few issues where I think it's important to give some of the recommendations an airing, not least because it may be that some persuasion is still required. On the issue of cross-border hire, as we've already heard, it cannot be right that local authorities in places like Rotherham and Sheffield that have had particular issues with safeguarding children and young people, girls who've been sexually assaulted and raped, and private hire vehicles used as the means to carry out this dreadful exploitation and these horrendous crimes. It cannot be right that where local authorities have rightly responded, put in place enhanced safety standards and protections, it cannot be right that people can flout those protections simply by getting their vehicles registered in another licensing authority where they have lower standards. And I'm afraid this wild west of regulation is where we presently find ourselves. And it's not just an issue in terms of safety. I do believe very strongly that there are some licensing authorities who give out licences like sweets because they enjoy the revenues. They know that the drivers who are securing those licences have no intention of driving in the licensing authority where the licence is issued, and they know that those drivers will be somebody else's problem. Well, that simply isn't fair. It isn't a sustainable position, but it is the position that we find ourselves in. I think the proposal to address this, where any journey must either start or finish in the area where the licence is issued, is a very common sense and practical way to deliver it. It's known as the A to B, B to A model, or ABBA for short. And since we know the Prime Minister is such a big fan of ABBA, I hope that we will take on board the report's recommendation to end this practice of cross-border hiring. It would stop local authorities only thinking of the money, money, money. And let's be clear that local authorities support these proposals. The Local Government Association recognises this challenge. There are lots of local authorities that are victims of this practice, and I think that's why the LGA has issued the SOS they have. with their briefing ahead of this debate, hoping that ministers will take it on board. There is such strong support for this that I wouldn't want to see ministers facing their Waterloo if they didn't take on board this recommendation. I promise that is the end of the ABBA references. But I hope that ministers will look very carefully at the strong evidence base on the need for change and the practical proposals. Now, it has been raised that there may be, particularly in some parts of the country where licensing authorities are smaller in scale and actually there are a number of licensing authorities in close proximity to each other, where there may need to be a pragmatic approach where drivers may indeed be operating across a number of different licensing authorities during the course of their work. But I think we've just got to make it absolutely clear that that should not prevent in any way drivers from being licensed in a number of authorities where they intend to work. If it's the case, I mean, in London we have a London-wide licensing authority, but let's imagine, for argument's sake, that we didn't. And drivers in my constituency, in the London Borough of Redbridge, also wanted to operate in Barking and Dagenham or Havering or Newham. Well, then they ought to be able to be licensed in those areas. Luckily, we've got a London-wide licensing model. It may actually be that local authorities want to join together to create larger licensing areas. I think government ought to be permissive about these approaches so that appropriate local solutions can be adopted. But we simply must end this Wild West regulation. We must end the scope for drivers to flout very important safety regulations, and we must end this practice of local authorities dishing out licences like sweets. The second issue I wanted to turn to is the proposal to give local authorities the power to cap the number of vehicles in their licensing area. Now, I think it's important to emphasise that this proposal is for a permissive power. It certainly wouldn't be the expectation. In fact, I don't think it would be desirable for every licensing authority to impose unnecessary caps. But I think particularly on the streets of London, but also other big cities, we have actually got to a position where the number of private hire vehicles in particular has exploded beyond all reasonable proportions. The number of private hire vehicles in England reached record levels last year, having increased by 37% since 2011. There's been, by comparison, just a 3% increase in taxis. In London, the number of private hire vehicles jumped by 39% to 87,400, and driver numbers, PHV numbers, increased by 39%. The number of drivers increased further to 117,700. Now, the problem with this situation we have in London is it doesn't benefit anybody. It doesn't benefit consumers, because even if they find it easier to hail a private hire vehicle, not they should be hailing, but to order a private hire vehicle via an app or to ring up a minicab office, it's no good to them if they're then stuck in heavy congestion trying to get to wherever they're going. It doesn't work for private hire drivers who tell me that they have seen their hourly wages going down. Because it's all right if you're a big multinational company with loads of drivers on your books and you're still raking in the revenues from their hard work. What companies, I'm afraid, like Uber are doing is saturating the market, not just to literally drive the competition off the road, but also at the expense of their own drivers. Because if you've got, as we do have, particularly in central London, huge concentrations of Uber drivers operating in the same area, they're competing for the same number of customers, even if as we accept, the market has grown for private hire use in London in recent years, you're still competing for the same number of passengers. And so what you get is this scourge of drivers driving round and round and round the streets of London, pumping out toxic chemicals into our air, reducing our air quality. And even if, by the way, those vehicles aren't the most polluting vehicles, the congestion that they create on the streets of London are allowing the most congested vehicles to pump more and more fumes out into our air. And I think those are some of the many reasons why the Mayor of London and Transport for London have been very clear in requesting from government the powers that they need, that they wish to use to cap the number of private hire licences issued in London. So I hope that is a permissive power that ministers will consider carefully and introduce, and I hope that they will put trust in local licensing authorities to make decisions appropriate to their areas. It's no good that we keep on talking about localism if we're not actually giving local authorities the powers that they need, the tools to do the job. The third issue that I think we really do need to address is this long-running saw about applying for hire. It has been years since the Law Commission recommended that government introduce a statutory definition on applying for hire, but we still haven't seen one. I mean, the situation ought to be clear in that taxis alone reserve the right to be able to be available for immediate hire, to be hailed either on the street or at a taxi rank. That has been a key privilege, recognising that licensed taxis are held to higher standards. They have to jump over higher bars and higher hurdles. They're more highly regulated than any other part of the system too. But I think it is increasingly clear that companies like Uber are absolutely flouting the spirit of the law when it comes to private applying for hire. And I think it's time for government to now to strengthen the letter of the law so there can be no room for confusion or ambiguity about where we stand on this particular issue. The final issue I wanted to raise is about mandatory disability equality training. I really wouldn't expect this issue to be a source of controversy, but it has, I'm afraid, been a bit too difficult to persuade government of the need for reform in this area so far. As it stands, I think the government is committed to guidance rather than having a mandatory obligation on the part of drivers to undergo mandatory disability equality training. The problem is, as we've heard from a range of disability charities, that the experience of disabled people when using vehicles has not been overall a happy one, and with the consistency of service that we would expect. Guide dogs, for example, who have a training facility in my constituency and who've given evidence to the all-party parliamentary group on taxis in the past, note that discrimination against assistance dog owners is widespread, and the worst offenders for refusing access to assistance dogs are private hire vehicle and taxi drivers. According to Guide Dogs, in a one-year period, 42% of assistance dog owners were refused by a PHV or taxi driver because of their assistance dogs. We've also heard other complaints from people with a whole range of disabilities that their needs aren't properly met. This proposal has widespread support. The Transport Select Committee, the Law Commission, the House of Lords Select Committee on the Equality Act, and the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Taxis has supported this measure. So, in conclusion, Sir David, I would just impress upon ministers again, the case for reform has been clearly made. The need for reform is urgent, but happily for ministers and business managers in the government, as we have seen this afternoon with the contribution of people right across the House, including former members of the Cabinet, former ministers responsible. It is very clear that there is strong cross-party support for the entirety of this report, and I hope it's on the basis of this report that the Department for Transport proceeds, and urgently.
Yeah.
I didn't set a time limit, so I'm not able really to limit to a member. I'm probably only going to be able now to call one more member, John Hayes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Sir David. Dr. Johnson spoke of the virtues of travelling hopefully, but travelling hopefully depends on travelling efficiently, effectively, securely, and most of all, safely. And this excellent report, led by Professor Abdul Haq, the foreword says, and I quote, that the necessity is to chart a future which ensured public safety for all. And it is public safety that lies at the heart of this report's work and of our endeavours in debating it today. The recommendations of the report focus on how taxis are licensed and how that licensing is enforced and complied with. And compliance and enforcement are critical to a number of the recommendations. The establishment in recommendation 23 of a database which allows the exchange of information between licensing authorities to check on the bona fide of applicants is critical. The recommendation in 24, similarly. And throughout this report, there is a focus on ensuring that those who apply for licences are fit and proper people on who the public can rely. But there's a second issue, and that's the working conditions of drivers, and my right friend referred to it earlier. It is absolutely clear to me that there is exploitation of drivers, that their working conditions are at best, and I put this most generously, variable, and the minimum standards are not being enforced currently. There is need for urgent reform. I'm not speaking, of course, of our black cab drivers who are self-employed very largely, who determine their own working day and working year. And my right-hand friend's rights are celebrated worldwide for their quality. I mean, it does seem to me to be extraordinary that we should be jeopardising that worldwide reputation for what modern economists call a disruptor. Well, I'm not a great fan of disruption of what works, Sir David. So I say that what matters more is doing what matters for the interests of the public and not fixing things that ain't broke, in the case, very largely, of black cab drivers. But there are other issues here. The recommendation 33 and 34 address working conditions and speak of the exploitation of drivers and the need to enforce the national living wage. And the restriction on the number of hours that private hire vehicle drivers typically drive, on safety grounds. There are other working conditions. There are other recommendations on the proper treatment of disabled people. It is appalling that some blind people have been refused the proper entitlement to take their guide dog with them on a private hire car journey. And I'm delighted that that recommendation finds its form in this report. The Honourable Member for Wealden has been remarkable in her willingness to listen, and I pay tribute to her as well as to Professor Abdul Haq. The cap that's been debated that's been raised by a number of members seems to me to be localism in practice. You can hardly argue for reinforcing the role of local authorities in regulating the circumstances of private hire and taxis, and then say they cannot make a judgment of what is the appropriate number of vehicles in a particular locality. But there's something more worrying still, is there not, Sir David? And that is that we know that in Rotherham and Rochdale and Oxford and Newcastle, that taxis were a key element in allowing the widespread abuse of vulnerable young women. The use of taxis for criminal purposes is a direct consequence of a regulatory system that is simply currently not fit for purpose, and we cannot allow that to continue. And the government would be unwise to hesitate for a moment in putting into place the necessary changes to avoid that eventuality. That's about more than taxes. It's about public confidence. It's about social cohesion. It's about building communal faith in a system that works for all, as Professor Abdul Haq has argued. So this can't be a cherry-picking exercise. The report must be adopted in full. There's not a single recommendation here with which I don't agree. And it would be quite wrong if the government cherry-picked, and I know this minister, this newly promoted minister, who must be basking in the glory of his seemingly unstoppable rise up the greasy pole of politics. I know this minister will want to listen closely to what's been said today and to work with the member for Wealden to make sure it is implemented speedily. Sir David, let me finish by saying this. Let me finish by saying this and just this. Dr. Johnson spoke, as I said, of travelling hopefully. But the government now needs to focus on the destination. And the destination must be implementation of this report with legislation where necessary as soon as possible.
SNP spokesman Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Sir David. It's a pleasure to participate in this debate, and like the speakers before me, Mr Chair, I want to thank the Honourable Member for Cambridge for bringing this forward. As we've heard, Sir David, taxis are now an integral part of our lives, providing jobs and opportunities to people across the UK, enhancing transport links to our local and rural communities. And the report we are focusing on today by the Task and Finish Group on Taxi and Private Hire Vehicle Licence urges the UK Government to overhaul the regulatory regime for the taxi and private hire vehicle sector and has recommended minimum standards for drivers, vehicles and operators for taxi and private hire vehicles licensing. And there have been calls for the UK Government to convene a panel of regulators, passenger safety groups and operator representatives to determine what those minimum safety standards should be. And it has been suggested that licensing authorities should be able to set additional higher safety standards in safety and in all other aspects, depending on the requirements of particular local areas. As the Honourable Member for Cambridge and the Honourable Member for South Holland and the Deepings pointed out, I will indeed.
Thank you, Honourable Lady, for giving way and congratulate the Honourable Gentleman for bringing this debate forward to the House for consideration. The lines between a hackney carriage or a black taxi and a private hire vehicle have become so blurred. There are those who know how to play those blurry lines to their benefit, and those who have paid the price through fines and even the loss of licence. Does the Honourable Lady agree that this report gives the opportunity to have regulation, and that regulation should be across the whole of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland?
I think the Honourable Gentleman makes an excellent point about the blurring of the boundaries. I would simply say, and I'm going to go on and talk about this a wee bit more detail, that taxi licensing is devolved in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and there are slight, and they are pretty slight but pretty important divergences across the UK which deal with the kind of issues that the Honourable Gentleman has raised. The Susie Lamplugh Trust research showed that for taxi and private hire vehicles, private hire vehicle drivers revealed that only 46 out of 316 local authorities were able to provide it with detailed information about drivers' criminal histories on request. Indeed, the research went on to reveal a significant number of licensed drivers with serious criminal convictions. The fact is that the fit and proper person test, which is applied to anyone applying to drive a taxi or private hire car, is pretty ambiguous and means that some local authorities are granting and renewing licences that perhaps we would not want them to. The Local Government Association in England is creating a voluntary register, as we heard from the Honourable Member from Cambridge. And this, of course, is a very interesting idea. But if it is voluntary, then inevitably its impact will be limited if it is to bring about the changes that many of us would like to see. We know that the advent of smartphone apps is already having a significant impact on the way that taxis and private hire cars operate. And this is challenging existing businesses. We've heard a lot about that today. And it's challenging existing business and regulatory models all the time. But we really need all and any taxi or private hire company to comply with the existing licensing requirements set out in legislation and to ensure that all vehicles and drivers are properly licensed. And we heard much about that from the Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green. We also need to pay attention to the unfair working practices and ensure that those working in the so-called gig economy have fair, protected and decent working conditions. If work has to be flexible, it should still be fair. The two are not mutually exclusive. Workers should have appropriate rights and protections, including sick pay and holiday pay, and it was disappointing that the Taylor Review didn't quite match up to many hopes in tackling the real issues facing workers in insecure employment. But as I said earlier in my answer to the Honourable Gentleman from Strangford, of course, taxi licensing is devolved in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but the licensing systems across the UK are similar. But there are important differences, and one of the major differences, and something which campaigners have flagged up, and something that's been made much of today, is the issue of cross-border hiring of private hire vehicles. In Scotland, private hire vehicles are required to return to their licensing area to accept a booking after travelling outside that area, so that a private hire vehicle driver in, for example, Glasgow, can accept a fare in Glasgow that takes them out of the city, but they cannot pick someone up outside the city. They must return to Glasgow to pick up another fare. And I see no reason why the Minister can't give serious consideration for the regulatory system in England. But there remains the problem of drivers illegally picking up off the streets without prior booking, and this often overlaps with cross-border hiring. These so-called pirate cabbies do have an impact on the livelihoods of other taxis and private hire car drivers that do follow the rules. As well as this, it can potentially put the public at risk, and I would wager that these so-called pirate cabbies are causing problems across Scotland and the entire United Kingdom, where cross-border, even in Scotland where cross-border hiring is illegal. And most particularly, I would suggest it is likely to be a problem in big cities like Glasgow, Belfast, London, Cambridge, on the busiest nights of the week, especially Fridays and Saturdays, and clearly more enforcement would help. This practice is a breach of cab licensing restrictions and invalidates car insurance, and this illegal taxi touting, where often the illegal pickup is charged way over the odds for their journey, is an issue I know in Scotland in which Police Scotland is particularly interested. But there's also the contentious issue of over-provision, about which we've heard much today. And until fairly recently in Scotland, local councillors had no power to limit the number of private hires on the streets. But with new legislation, that has been changed, which allows a licensing authority to refuse to grant an application for a private hire licence on the very grounds of over-provision of private hire cars in the area in which the driver plans to operate. Any assessment of over-provision must, of course, look at current provision, as well as the use and demand for the service of both taxis and private hires, to ensure that demand can be fulfilled and there is fairness to all in the industry. Local flexibility is very important, and it's also important that there should be a minimum number of wheelchair-accessible vehicles, as the Honourable Member for Cambridge pointed out. And we've heard calls for CCTV licensing in cabs, but that's more controversial because, as well as cost considerations, there is also concerns about intrusion. As the way we live our lives, access our leisure pursuits, as we increasingly rely on technology, as public transport can be challenging for some of our communities at certain times of the evening, taxi and private hire licensing also becomes more challenging, since our priority must be to keep the public safe, as well as creating a fair and reasonable environment for those who make their living out of providing this important service. Today we've heard some of these concerns, and we've also heard a little bit about some of the divergences, the different direction we've gone in Scotland. But the concerns raised are important and they require our attention, and I'm very keen to hear what the Minister intends to do in answer to these concerns, and if he's had a look at how things operate in Scotland, and if any of these measures are perhaps things he would wish to adopt.
Matt Roder.
Thank you, Sir David. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'd like to also congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Cambridge, for securing this important debate and for the work he's been doing on the licensing of taxi and private hire vehicles. With his private members' bill, he's shown more initiative than the government to ensure that we legislate in this Parliament to require taxi and private hire vehicle licensing authorities in England to share information with other licensing authorities in order to prevent unsuitable people being granted licences. I should say that in our manifesto at the general election last year, the Labour Party pledged that we would reform the legislation governing taxi and private hire services, introducing national standards to guarantee safety and accessibility. And I would like to thank the Right Honourable Member of South Holland and the Deepings, who instigated the group's report, and I hope that his colleagues on the government benches will now act on it. So while we welcome the many recommendations in the Task and Finish Group's report and the work of Professor Hack, it's frustrating that the government has failed so far to legislate during their 8 years in power, despite the calls of Labour and other opposition parties, trade unions, campaigners, and I will accept the intervention.
Merely to
put on record the thanks the whole country should have to Professor Hack for leading this working party, the minister who set it up, many of the working party who I can see actually in the public gallery. But might not, even if the government don't want to move generally, there's one thing they could do, and that is to say, for those licensing authorities, they could act against companies such as Uber by insisting that people get the legal minimum rate for the hours that they're clocked on for work.
Thank you, Sir David. I'm grateful to my honourable friend's intervention, and I share his concern about the role of Uber in this and the need for urgent action to tackle the abuses. So while we welcome the recommendations, 8 years in power is a long time to leave this issue and to not tackle it, and I do think it's now time to move on. The government's hands-off approach to taxis and private hire vehicles means that they've been presiding over a race to the bottom on quality, accessibility, and also, as we've heard today, on safety. A number of serious incidents have demonstrated that taxi and private hire vehicle passengers are simply not adequately protected. So, David, as technology in the industry has evolved, our regulation of the taxi and private hire vehicle industry has simply failed to keep pace. The industry is changing rapidly, and yet the legal framework governing taxi services is almost 200 years old, while private hire services legislation dates from the mid-1970s in most of England and Wales and 1998 in London. The piecemeal evolution of the regulation of taxi and private hire services has resulted in a complex and indeed fragmented licensing system where services differ greatly depending on where in the country you are. There are no national standards, resulting in a very variable picture, primarily with regards to quality, safety and accessibility. One of the most significant challenges facing the taxi trade that ministers have stalled over, but which my honourable friend, the member for Cambridge, has addressed with his bill, is indeed the issue of cross-border working by private hire vehicles. There have been concerns about private hire vehicles operating outside their licensed geographical areas, as we've heard today. It puts taxis at a competitive disadvantage as they have to return to their licensed area after taking a fare outside their borough, unlike private hire vehicles. Some councils in the country hand out too many licences, clogging up the streets, as we've heard, and worsening congestion and air quality, as the honourable member for Ilford mentioned earlier. Illegal levels of air pollution cause 40,000 premature deaths each year, and they are indeed the UK's most severe public health crisis. Despite repeatedly dragging through the courts, the government has refused to act, including failing to include taxi and private hire vehicle policy as part of a wider clean air strategy, which I believe is quite a serious omission. Greater levels of investment in charging infrastructure and greater support for taxi and private hire vehicle companies who wish to switch to electric fleets is also required. However, in areas of illegal air quality, it may be better to reduce the total amount of traffic in one particular area. So I note with interest that the Task and Finish Group's recommendation that the government should allow legislation to enable local authorities where there's a proven need to set a cap on the number of taxi and private hire vehicles that they licence. This proposal, Sir David, could help authorities to solve challenges around congestion, air quality and parking, and ensure appropriate provision of taxi and private hire services for passengers, while at the same time, and this is very important, maintaining drivers' working conditions, which we've heard about today. I'm interested in hearing the Minister's response to this specific point later. The implications of cross-border licensing arrangements for safety are, as we said earlier, deeply worrying. Local authorities are presently permitted to set their own fit and proper criteria for licensing. Dangerous private hire drivers are therefore able to operate in an area with stringent safety criteria, as my honourable friend who's no longer in our place from Sheffield, Healy, mentioned earlier. And this is indeed something which we need to tackle. As a result, local authorities such as Rotherham and Oxford, which have set strict criteria following the incidences of child sexual exploitation, are powerless to act in this cross-border matter. And rather than addressing this problem, the Government's Deregulation Act of 2015 permitted the subcontracting of licensing, and that has made the situation worse. Enforcement by local licensing authorities is now more difficult, and passengers are being stripped of their right to choose which operator they wish to travel with. So the Government should include in future national minimum standards the requirement for all taxi drivers to undertake safeguarding and child sexual abuse and exploitation awareness training, including the positive role that drivers can play in spotting and reporting signs of abuse and neglect of vulnerable passengers. In the further interest of passenger safety, the report recommended that government standards should mandate all vehicles be fitted with visual and audio CCTV, subject to strict data protection measures. In the light of threats to passenger safety, there is indeed a strong argument for this measure. The report also found that such standards would support greater consistency in licensing, potentially reducing costs and indeed assisting in out-of-area compliance. So I therefore ask the Minister what steps the government will take to combat the problems associated with cross-border working. One obvious measure to mitigate the problem would be the introduction of national standards for licensing authorities, something which Labour has repeatedly called for. I hope the Minister will now commit to introducing such standards. The government has previously stated that many of these issues should be the responsibility of licensing authorities, but issues such as disability access, safety standards should not, in my view, be at the discretion of local authorities, which indeed vary greatly across the country. In May 2010, the Law Commission published a report recommending wholesale reform of taxi and private vehicle hire licensing. The report found that the balance struck between national and local rules lacks an overarching rationale, I'm quoting from the report, resulting in duplication, inconsistencies and considerable difficulties in cross-border enforcement. The outdated legislative framework has become too extensive in some respects, imposing unnecessary burdens. The government didn't respond to this beyond saying they were considering it. Surely the government should simply not ignore this report. Meanwhile, the industry has changed significantly throughout the years and continues to do so, increasingly spurred on through technological change. I'm conscious of time, Sir David, and I wish to just move to my closing remarks, if I may. The former Mayor of London, now the Honourable Member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip, at one point during his tenure in City Hall, planned to reduce a minimum 5-minute wait for customers requesting a car at the beginning a journey. And this is motivated by concerns about the impact of Uber's business model in London, which we've heard so much of earlier. Those plans were abandoned after intense lobbying, and I do think it's worth reviewing this again. The advent of smartphone apps is changing the industry and presents many clear benefits to passengers, but companies such as Uber currently enjoy unfair competitive advantages because they do not have to follow the same regulation as other businesses. So, Sir David, in moving to conclude, licensing authorities should use their existing enforcement powers to take strong action where disability access refusals are reported to deter further cases. And finally, we welcome the recommendation that central government and licensing authorities should level the playing field by mitigating additional costs faced by the trade where a wider social benefit is provided, for example, where a wheelchair or accessibility measures are offered. We've seen real progress in London on these matters. I look forward to hearing what steps the Minister will take on the many questions I've asked him today. Thank you, Sir David.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Sir David. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. If I may state the government's position briefly, in the first instance, very much in the spirit of the Honourable Member for Ilford North, Sir David, I would say, mamma mia. We cannot allow this to be one last summer, nor can it be hasta mañana. It's not quite SOS, but we can't allow the taxi trade to, say, take a chance on me. And above all, as my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford, has said, it cannot be winner takes it all. I congratulate the honourable gentleman on securing this debate and about the report of the Task and Finish Group on taxi and private hire vehicle licensing. Unfortunately, the Minister responsible for taxi and private hire vehicle policy, as the Chamber will have detected, is unfortunately unable to be here. She's overseas on a ministerial visit. But I have noted, and I know she will read when she reads the account of this debate, the very warm words that colleagues across the House have had for her work, and also for the work of my honourable friend, my right honourable friend, the member for South Holland and the Deepings, in whose steps it is a pleasure to tread in the department. I know that a better regulation of this sector is something that honourable gentlemen and gentlewomen across the House regard as a very important issue, and we in the department very much share that view. I'd be delighted to give way.
Thank you, Sir David. Can I first also add my grateful appreciation and thanks for Professor Abdul Hak's report, which I thought was brilliant and well-informed and well-intentioned. And could I ask my honourable friend that if we embrace modern technology, it won't be, or it need not be, too expensive, too onerous, too complex to adopt most of the recommendations in the report?
Well, my honourable friend tempts me to comment, Sir David, on the contents of announcements that will be forthcoming relatively soon, and I don't think I should do that for reasons that the House will understand, but I think his point is well made, and certainly we've all, many of us, been the beneficiaries of increased technology in our lives as well as in our travel. I would say this, that ministers regret in the department very much that the private members' bill, which the honourable gentleman Cambridge introduced, appears unlikely to be successful. We all know, and he has reminded us today, of the very considerable efforts that he has made to increase safety and of the support he received from officials in the department to bring forward that bill, which the government was pleased to be able to support. I'm going to pick up many of the issues that have been raised today. I'll say some general words and then pick up the questions that have been specific matters that have been touched on. As we recognise, Sir David, in recent years, the taxi and private hire industry has experienced very rapid growth and significant change brought about by innovation and the application of new technologies, my friend from Bristol has just mentioned. These changes contributed to the announcement of the formation of the Task and Finish Group. Honourable members will recall that that announcement was made at a Westminster Hall debate in July of last year by the former Minister, my honourable friend, the member for South Holland and the Deepings. The goal of that group was to consider issues raised relating to taxi and private hire vehicle licensing, but also, of course, their potential remedies. The group first met in September of last year with an intention to submit a report later that year. The work they did revealed a degree of agreement, a high degree of agreement in many ways, but also very strongly held and disparate views as to solutions. It's important to put that on the record. And I'm sure that will come as no surprise to anyone who has engaged with the taxi and private hire vehicle regulation over the years. The report was delayed, but that enabled the already well-informed group to consider the numerous submissions received from organisations across the country, including a wide range of stakeholders, such as those working in the trade, regulators, the police, disability organisations, and trade unions, just to name a few. And the longer time frame gave the group the opportunity to question many of these organisations and to learn more about their concerns and the specific matters relating to them. As I trust colleagues will understand, and as I've said already, I cannot advise them of the government's response at this stage, but I can say in reassurance that the work that's being done within the department is near completion and that a government response setting out how it intends to reform the regulation of the sector will be issued very shortly. I really wouldn't be appropriate for me, least of all since I'm not the minister responsible directly for this, to comment on the timing. But I think very shortly is encouraging words when issued by uttered by any minister, and I hope my right honourable friend will take comfort from that. I too would like to take on my friend, on behalf of my friend, the member for Wealden, behalf as well as, of course, my own, this opportunity to thank the chair of the group, Professor Abdel Haq, for his work. It's been much said across the chamber that his work has been welcomed and is well regarded for its clarity and for the ingenuity with which he has brought the disparate voices together. While the recommendations he has made in his report may not be, in every case, unanimously supported by all the members of the group, he has achieved a great deal of consensus, and for that he should be congratulated. The report sets out the Professor's view of what is needed from both central and local government to ensure the safety of passengers and the long-term success of the sector. There are 34 recommendations, some of which focus on short-term fixes and others that need to be achieved by licensing authorities using extensive existing powers. In the medium term, the recommendations focus on greater consistency in licensing, for government to legislate to set national minimum standards, as has been discussed today, and to enable effective enforcement through greater powers for enforcement officers and better sharing of information between licensing authorities. As I've said, the government will be responding to the report very shortly, but it is already seeking to increase the consistency in licensing. Ministers will very shortly launch a consultation on safety-related statutory guidance to be issued to licensing authorities. The draft guidance has been the subject of extensive discussion and engagement, including a review by the Task and Finish Group. It represents an important first step in ensuring that all passengers will be carried by someone who has undergone rigorous checks to ensure they are fit and proper as legislation requires. This should apply regardless of where they travel and by whom the driver and vehicle are licensed both issues that have been raised here today. Some of the recommendations made in the statutory guidance and the Task and Finish Group report will impose additional burdens on the trade. While one would sooner that those measures were unnecessary, it is absolutely vital, and ministers recognise it's vital, to act on the lessons from the KC and J reports. A single attack, as the remark well known and I think agreed by all, it is too many, and we must protect passengers from any driver seeking to abuse that position of trust. Now, of course, the group's remit extended beyond the vital area of safety. That is to say, the way in which the sector is regulated and the welfare of those working within it have been the subjects of increasing concern as well, and they've been raised in this debate today. Many of those concerns stem from the innovation and application of new technologies, be that the requesting a vehicle via an app, whether a taxi or a private hire vehicle, the increasingly popular use of apps, the fundamental difference between what private hire vehicles and taxis are permitted to do, in law at least, has not changed. There may be blurring, but the fundamental basis of it has not changed. Taxis alone have the hard-earned right to apply for act to hire, and action must be taken against those who are breaking the law in that regard. Taxis offer a premium service to passengers, providing confidence that drivers have knowledge of the local area and, in some areas, guarantees as to accessibility of vehicles, another matter raised today. Private hire vehicles provide a different range of services, and while there is a wide range of views as to the relative merits of some of the new entrants to that sector, many of these services are, we must not forget, popular with the public. The government supports choice for consumers and wants to see both the taxi industry and the private hire vehicle industry prosper. Local authority enforcement officers have a vital role in maintaining the differentiation and fair competition between the two sides, that is, taxis and private hire vehicles. They also play an important role in ensuring that unlicensed, unvetted, uninsured and unsafe drivers and vehicles are prohibited from circumventing the regulations and stealing business from the legitimate trade. The emergence of disruptive businesses through the application of new technologies has created new products and services that have the potential to meet the demands of consumers still better. But these have provided greater flexibility in working arrangements and increased employment opportunities. But, of course, one recognises, and has been raised today also, they have drawbacks as well. The implications of gig working extend far beyond this sector, and that's why the Prime Minister commissioned Matthew Taylor to conduct a review of modern working practices. As I have already mentioned, just to pick up some of the other points that have been raised, the report raises the issue of accessibility training, and the government is considering that very closely. The same is also true as to the need for national standards. And as I've mentioned, the government expects to consult soon on statutory guidance as to safeguarding. As regards the question of a national database, the government is considering all things that could be done to improve safety, and the response will include this question too. I think it's unfair for me to continue to say response will continue, so I think I should allow the honourable member the chance to wind up his own debate.
Daniel Zeichner to wind up.
I'm very grateful, Sir David, and very grateful to the Minister for giving me a moment just to wind up. Can I thank everyone who's contributed to, I think, what has been a full debate. We haven't been able to cover every single issue this afternoon. Just a couple of things I wanted to very quickly raise that haven't been touched on: the use of CCTV, some of the anxieties if we have larger licensing authorities about potential clustering in city centres. But I'd like to finish, Sir David, by echoing the wise words of the Right Honourable Member for South Holland and the Deepings. He said he's not in favour of disruption. I think I'm more disruptive than he is. But one thing you would not want to disrupt are things that are precious, and the most precious thing is safety, Sir David. And I think that is the theme that's come through this debate this afternoon, which is why I'm pleased to hear the Minister's promising action very shortly. We will keep him to it, because it is very, very important that the messages that have come through from this excellent report, and we thank again the Professor and his group for producing it, that safety is paramount and we need swift action.
The question is that this House has considered the Task and Finish Group report on taxi and private hire licensing. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.